Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Asim Qureshi. I am the Research Director of the Advocacy Group CAGE, based in the UK. It's my great honor to have been invited to chair a panel discussion with three very distinguished guests for the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. For those of you who may be new to CCF, it's a wonderful organization based in the US who campaign for the rights of those who have been denied due process, is particularly political prisoners within the context of the global war on terror. So please do check out their website and their work. They really do phenomenal work and very much worth supporting with your time, energy, and money. So I have three panelists today who are going to discuss various aspects of the two films that are going to be shown. One is The Road to Guantanamo and the other, The Confession. So first, we have my colleague at CAGE and obviously, and more importantly, a former Guantanamo Bay detainee, Moazzam Begg. Also with us, we have Aliya Hussain for the Center for Constitutional Rights. Again, another brilliant organization in the US who we at CAGE have done a lot of work with in the past. Aliya runs their advocacy programs there. And finally, we have Mat Whitecross, who is a brilliant filmmaker and director. He directed and made The Road to Guantanamo, and it's a real privilege to have him here to speak to us about that film. And so, yeah, thank you all for being with us today. So I'm going to jump right in, if that's okay, and really get into some of the questions that I've got for you all, because, you know, these are really two wonderful films in their own right. One is a documentary that's done in an interview style, and the other a fictionalized kind of recounting of the Tipton Three and their journey to Guantanamo and back. But I want to start with Aliya, please. You know, the experiences of those in Guantanamo, they've been depicted now in a number of different ways over the years. How do you feel that the image of the base has changed over this period of time? And to what extent has popular culture and the various films that have been made played a role in changing that depiction?
Thanks so much. I just want to say I'm really honored to be here, and especially to be talking with Matt and Moazzam, who are incredible storytellers, and grateful to storytellers because they make sort of my job and doing advocacy a lot easier. You know, by design, there's so much about Guantanamo that continues to this day to be secret, censored. Much of what you know about Guantanamo is because of what the government tells you. Luckily, with lawyers and advocates and former detainees who've been able to speak out, we're learning a lot more. So, you know, just to give some context, I started going down to Guantanamo in 2012 as a paralegal with Center for Constitutional Rights lawyers. So 2012, the prison had been open for 10 years. And so there was a fair amount that we knew about Guantanamo then. But when I visited, I was really surprised to see what I saw in these meetings, which were that these were men my age. Many of them had come to Guantanamo when they were 17, 19, 20, 21, and they had been there for 10 years. Most of them had never been charged with a crime. These were sons, fathers, brothers, and they had dreams for their future, etc. And many of those stories just aren't told in the media. And so, you know, I think pop culture has played such an important role in talking about Guantanamo over time. So I think many people know about the torture of the Bush years, the connection with war, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, some of the things that we've seen in both of these films. And there's also a misconception that torture has stopped. In some ways it has, some of the more overt forms of torture, but over time, we see that abuse continues, humiliation, that psychological torture of continuing detention without charge or trial and not knowing when or if you'll ever be released. And also this idea that for things like force feeding, solitary confinement, which continue to this day, can also be considered forms of torture. So I think over time, pop culture and films and important books that have come out have really painted that picture of Guantanamo past the Bush years. You know, we now know that we have a fourth president who's presiding over Guantanamo. So I think showing what happens after the Bush years has been a really important piece of the Guantanamo story. And in terms of how the image of the base has changed, I think people are asking different questions now. 20 years later, I'm hearing more people say, why is Guantanamo still open? Why didn't Obama close it? And also, why are people still there? Is it because of what they've done? Is it because of Congress? Like, there are a lot more questions, I think, surrounding the conversation than maybe there were even at the times of Road to Guantanamo, which is still relatively early. So I think the image has changed, and in particular, there was a time during the 2013 hunger strike, mass hunger strike at the prison, which really put Guantanamo, I think, back in the spotlight. Many people had forgotten about it, including President Obama, and that's where we saw sort of artists and storytellers and journalists and celebrities and people really paying attention and drawing the stories of the men out of the prison, which you can't really replicate as much as you want to with traditional advocacy. So I think the storytelling has helped focus the conversation on the people and not just the politics, not just the policy. So I'm really grateful for film and pop culture in doing that.
Thank you. That's great. Moazzam, the experience of many detainees, on their own roads to Guantanamo, they were quite varied. You've met the Tipton Three, of course. We have many times in the UK, and especially you met them after your return. To what extent did you feel your experience differed to the one they had, particularly as it's portrayed in Matt's film?
Assalamu alaikum all. Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing the film very early on, when not long after I came back from Guantanamo myself, and listening to their experience, it was very clearly vivid and shocking, far more shocking than anything I experienced, especially being locked up in those containers and on the convoy of death. And of course, having spoken to many former Guantanamo prisoners later, knowing that many of them, or some of them rather, at least 60 or 70 out of 600 or so, survived what happened next, which was the Kalaijangi Massacre, the biggest prison massacre in modern history, in which they diverted a stream, electrocuted them, poured gasoline inside to burn them, fired rockets and tank shells and aerial bombardment. It was unbelievable what happened. And still, the fact that none of this has actually come to the fore yet, there's been no proper, meaningful investigation, suggests to me that this is just, when I saw what happened to the Tipton guys, of course, that they themselves laughed it off. They're very funny guys. They're quite apolitical, and they're quite atypical of the Guantanamo prisoners. I would say myself, I'd gone to many places around the world, gone to conflict zones, was involved in different stuff, but these guys they were just off, from a different place. They stumbled into this place, and it's very visible. And you can have a big laugh and a joke with these guys, and you can see that right through the film. And I'm sure Matt experienced that very, very clearly, especially with those strong Black country accents, for which they often said they needed translators. The Americans needed translators to be able to interpret for them. But that aside, their experience, though, as I said, they don't seem to be very typical of the Guantanamo type prisoner, though there is a vast, you're talking about almost 800 prisoners from 41 different countries, and the varying experiences of the Uyghurs, for example, from East Turkestan in China, to Mahmoud Ghorani in Chad, are quite different, and how they react to things are different. But what the road to Guantanamo told me was the banality, the ordinariness of where these guys came from. Yeah, there's lots of people asking question marks. Yeah, but you must have done something. There's no smoke without fire. That question mark always stays there. But the real issue is, what the hell did you do that was so bad that you would be subjected to this kind of cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment and be subjected to a massacre? What is it that you did that you'd have to lie in a container full of dead people and you haven't any water to drink, so you take off the t-shirts of the dead bodies to get the condensations that's collected on those t-shirts, and then squeeze it to get the water into your mouth. What kind of things did you do? And of course the answer is you didn't do anything. And that's the issue. You're interrogated by the world's most powerful law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and together, including your own government, they're all involved. And after all of that, you still haven't got any evidence against these guys. So the big question remains for me, the biggest question that remains for me, is that there are war crimes here that have taken place over 20 years, detailed, documented in films like The Road to Guantanamo, that still, there's not even a suggestion that there's going to be any accountability for this. The best thing we've ever seen, if you want to call it that, for accountability, was Obama saying, we tortured some folks, we've learned some mess lessons. Look at that. And the CIA Senate torture report, in which they accept that they've tortured over 119 prisoners, but not a soul will be held accountable. So that was, and when you see the Tipton guys, you think to yourself, wow, you've gone through that. You live in the land of the closest ally to the United States of America, but you will never get any justice. It will never happen. There never will be a process in which America at least could say, we're sorry. But for war crimes, sorry is not good enough. And as long as that continues, I think that these type of films will have a longevity, and people need to see them.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Matt, Moazzam's spoken about the Tipton Three, and we should say what their names are. Shafiq, Ruhul, and Asif, not rather than just kind of referring to them by this title. And they are really wonderful guys. But what was it about their story in particular? Because there were a number of releases by that point. What was it about them that really compelled you to make a film about their journey and their story?
Well, I think I came from a background. My parents had been political prisoners in the 70s in Argentina. And I remember struggling to understand it myself and then struggling to explain it to other people, because I think, Muslims just saying no smoke without fire. There was an expression in Argentina at that time, which was por algo será. Like, so you got arrested by secret police in the middle of the night, por algo será, which like, there must be a reason. There's always a reason. No smoke without a fire. And people would cross the street to avoid their relatives after they've been in prison, because you just don't want to be tainted by association. And I just remember struggling to try and explain that to friends in England, just the whole concept of being arrested for no reason. And there was always this sense, yeah, okay, well, fine, well, maybe that happens in Latin American countries, but it can never happen over here. We have a strong system, and it's and the police are on the side of justice and all those kind of things. And the same thing with our army, and the same thing about the way that we navigate the world, and the way that we kind of represent ourselves internationally. And actually, you don't have to look too far into history to realize that's not true. So I was always looking for kind of parallels that we might find in terms of my parents' story. I wanted to try and tell their story at one point. And it's tricky with political films. I think maybe more now, we're in a different age of documentary, but certainly when I was starting out, it was very difficult to try and get people interested in these subjects. But then when I read the story of the Tipton Three and their connection with Gareth Peirce, for example, who represented them, immediately it was like, well, they're me. They're exactly the same as me. They are, I grew up with quite a political background. We used to talk politics at the table. And as Moazzam says, they're pretty apolitical. But actually, in some ways, I felt that was better, because it was just like, look, these guys feel completely disconnected to this whole reality of, the war on terror. And yet they were at the center of it. They really, exactly like you said, Moazzam, they stumbled into it. They was, in the nicest possible way, they were like a lot of my friends who were just kind of a little bit idiotic, just kind of didn't really know what they were doing. It was just kind of, well, this seems interesting. They were up for a bit of an adventure, just going over the border, which is, when we were filming in that region, it's what people do. You go, if someone says, well, you can go over the border and have a look around. Isn't that exciting? So yeah, the idea that these three guys, and it was four originally, obviously one of them died, went missing, but three guys who were just like me and like everyone else I know were at the center of this. And these were kind of these emblems of the war on terror. These were the enemy, and yet you don't only have to spend 5 minutes with any of them and realize they're just like average British kids, who are obsessed with so I went to stay with them as part of the research. We rented a house and stayed there for a few weeks together, just talking every day, and we'd spend like 2 or 3 hours talking, and then they could go off and lift weights and watch like property programs, which is what they were obsessed with at the time, and watch, kind of straight to video blockbusters, all that sort of thing. They were completely like everyone else. And what was fascinating to me is that they just had no clue of what they were getting themselves into. And yet they'd been held up by both governments really as somehow, they'd at one point when for years they were being accused of something nebulous. They deliberately didn't want to pin it down. The US and the UK didn't want to pin it down because they couldn't pin it down because there was no evidence. They hadn't done anything. And when finally it was like, well, look, we're going to have to come up with something. They accused them of being at the center of the planning with bin Laden of 9/11. And it was so ludicrous. They'd pitched it at such an astronomical level, such a ludicrous level. And obviously they'd also pinpointed a date. And they were saved by an alibi that they were working in Curry's at the time. I mean, it was that ludicrous, and there was CCTV footage to prove that they were in a different country. So the banality, like you said, Moazzam, it's madness. And so there's a kind of sick humor, dark humor to it, because it's so mad, but these are people's lives.
Can I just add to that really quickly? Because I remember when Clive Stafford Smith made a little documentary film, and he actually goes to Curry's and he says, can you tell me where your rocket launcher section is? And they say, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm working for the Tipton 3, and it's been accused that at this particular point in time, they were buying rocket launchers. So can you just tell me where your rocket launcher section is? It's just, that's the ludicrous nature of their allegations.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many instances of that. We had a lot of moments in that we wanted to film and then just did, either we didn't end up shooting or we ended up on the cutting room floor. But, to give a sense of the madness of it all, you had teenagers, 3 teenagers from Britain who went over there, didn't know what was going on, arrested by American teenagers who again didn't have a clue. They'd been sent over by their country, didn't have a clue where they were, who they were looking for. They were just, a lot of these people were shipped because you would get a big bonus, you get a huge, there were kind of prices on their heads. So anyone you could find, it could be a goat farmer, or even better if you found a British citizen over there. So they were handed over to the Americans. And there was one scene I remember, they were wandering around in Gap hoodies. Obviously by that stage they'd grown beards and stuff, so their hair was a bit longer. But I think the main thing was the difference, I suppose, between my dad, who was arrested as a British citizen in Argentina. He had his passport, and just as Tipton 3, he thought that was a kind of passport to freedom at any point. It's like you can any situation arises, you just wave it under people's noses and you get out. And luckily there was a huge campaign by Reuters and Amnesty International over in the UK, and it was mentioned in Parliament. And because he had that connection, that they were saved, but many people in Argentina weren't. When it came to the Tipton 3, they were not taken seriously because they weren't white. And so I think they had this encounter with this American soldier, and this was the moment where it could have gone either way. They could have gone back to Britain, or the other option was they go to Guantanamo indefinitely, maybe for 3 years, maybe forever. And so they've got their one moment of everything's hinging on this. And for me, that really, it kind of summed it all up. But in a way, I think it was kind of an embarrassment of riches in terms of all the drama of that film. But there was a moment where this guy, they're all in hoods, and this guy comes up to them and he goes, and they said, look, we're British citizens. You got to. They had these Brummie accents, so first we couldn't understand them. Then when they spoke slowly, he started to understand what they were talking about, and he said, "Oh, are you still there?"
Yeah,
we can hear you fine. Oh, I think we've lost Matt for a moment. Just when the punchline was coming as well.
Can I just add one thing that really resonated
of course, Aliya,
with me, that both Moazzam and Matt have said, with this idea of people actually being just like you. And I think that's another thing that I loved about both of these films, is you really get to know people as people, and not just victims, not just symbols of injustice, but actual people. And even in the Mauritanian, I mean, there's humor, there's warmth, there's compassion. There are all these different emotions that I think really resonate with an audience when they're watching films, because these are things that you don't really think of when you think of the Guantanamo story. But of course you have hundreds of individuals who come from different places, who have different personalities. Many of these guys who are in an American prison are sort of learning about American culture in certain ways. And that's, hip hop, that's television shows that seem very kind of odd for them to be watching, but they like. So, I've also found that these small anecdotes, which may not seem like the full story, but actually paint a really important picture, and I think resonate with people in order to really understand kind of the whole humanity of individuals and the people at Guantanamo.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's definitely true. While we wait for Matt, there was a question actually we received from the audience. In the meantime, they were asking about the massacre that Moazzam mentioned. And just to let you know, it's the Kalaijangi Massacre that took place in Afghanistan. In fact, there is a multi-part interview with the former Guantanamo Bay detainee Walid al-Hajj, which you can find online, where he actually describes what took place at the Kalaijangi Massacre in a lot of detail. It's very, very horrific. All right. Okay, so we've got Matt back now. Matt, I don't know if you want to finish that anecdote that you were on before we move on. No,
sure. No, well, it was really just to illustrate, I think, exactly what you're saying, Aliya, that it's the connection with real people, because I think it's all the one thing we kept on being told when we premiered the film in Berlin at the film festival was by people on the left kind of going, well, everyone knows all this. What's the point in making a film about it? And people on the right saying it was all lies. But I think you can read something like enhanced interrogation techniques on a piece of paper and you're, oh, okay, fine. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. And Donald Rumsfeld saying, well, I stand at my desk all the time. So what's the problem? I'm not being tortured. And then you see it and it's a whole different thing. Then you realize it is torture. And in the case of this teenage US soldier talking to Rule Ahmed, who was like a late teens Brummy teenager, he pulled up his hood. So the guys were hooded and he said, I'm British, you gotta believe me. I need to go home. So he pulled up his hood and he said, it started to put it up over his chin. He said, no, you've got a beard. People don't have beards in England. So the guy, there's ignorance on both sides. He was like, no. So they studied it. And then he pulled it up a bit further. He said, no, you've got brown skin. There's no people with brown skin in England. You've never been outside the US. And then finally he took it off and he was like, all right, if you're English, all right, we'll prove it then. Who's your prime minister? And he couldn't remember. So that was his moment. And eventually he guessed and said, is it John Major? So they're all right, off you go to Guantanamo. And that's the madness of it. And this was the guy who supposedly was the figurehead behind 9/11. We're not dealing with some criminal mastermind.
Thanks for that, sharing that. But yeah, I think it does speak a lot to some of the absurdity of what took place there. Aliya, I'm going to ask you, to what extent do you feel that the narrative of innocence is important in kind of conveying the unlawfulness or the lawlessness of Guantanamo? Is it possible even to critique Guantanamo, if these men had been kind of card-carrying members of Al-Qaeda, for example, in the US, within that US context that you obviously have to work in, to what extent is a rights-based discourse so determined by these kind of innocent characters, them having to be innocent in order for us to be able to humanize with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Center for Constitutional Rights, when we first took on representing men at Guantanamo in just the months after Guantanamo opened, we didn't know who was being sent there. We didn't know really who they were, what they had done, but we knew that they deserved to have representation. And part of that is because our own history actually was representing Haitians who were detained at Guantanamo in the 90s, seeking asylum in the US, but were HIV positive and were not allowed to enter. And so our president at the time, Michael Ratner, had seen that the US government had argued somewhat successfully that Guantanamo was a law-free zone. And so from the start, for us, it was really about bringing the law to Guantanamo, regardless of what people had done, whether they were guilty or innocent, that they deserved to be able to challenge their detention and have rights. And so we have tried not to fall into the trap of innocence and guilt. And I say a trap because I think it really is. One of our clients, Fahad Ghazi, wrote really powerfully that there's no guilt and no innocence here at Guantanamo. Those ideas are empty. That's just a game that's played, but there's always right and wrong, and that can never change. And so I think we've done a fairly good job at sort of putting the spotlight back on the US and other countries who have supported in some way sort of the rendition and torture program by focusing on things like torture, impunity, government overreach, lack of transparency, the war crimes and the crimes that were committed by the people in power. And it's been challenging. I think when you're doing storytelling, there's a desire to sort of present sympathetic people and draw out pieces of their story that will resonate. But I think that we've been able to do that without talking about innocence and guilt. And I think this is where this idea of a system that does not make sense can be really helpful. And I saw this especially in the confession, this idea of, if I've done something, bring me to court. What have I done? And so I do think that the narrative of never being charged with a crime, it sounds like a little legally and maybe a little bit awkward to say rather than innocent, but it really is focusing on the fact that these people have never been charged with a crime. And regardless of where there's smoke, there's fire. And, well, maybe it's like, well, there's no maybe, either you charge someone with a crime because they've committed a crime, or you should let them go. And I think this charge or release has been something we've called for in the beginning and sort of continue to this day. I think, there was a period, especially during the Obama administration, where we had to start focusing on individual storytelling, in part because the majority of the men at Guantanamo were from Yemen, and there weren't transfers to Yemen at that time. Many of them were cleared for release, and they needed to be resettled. So in order to kind of resettle them in third countries, we sort of felt the need to start talking about them as people, sons, fathers, brothers, who really imagined a life for themselves outside of Guantanamo, who had the skills, who were eager to sort of take on a new life and would do just fine. And I think in that individual storytelling, you focus on the pieces of people that are sympathetic. But now, fast forward a few more years, there are only 39 people at Guantanamo. And so focusing on the individual aspect, I think we're realizing is maybe less useful now than sort of focusing on the system as a whole. I mean, this is one of the smallest numbers of population we've had this entire time. And really just focusing on like abolishing this place, closing it, and really moving forward is the emphasis. So, I'm a little bit biased. I think we've managed to not rely on the innocence and guilt conversation. I also think there's like a really robust conversation happening in the US now around abolition. And I think that's also really changed how people understand the carceral state, and sort of no longer saying, well, people in prison deserve to be in prison. This idea of free them all, that actually the way the justice system has been created is to fail communities of color. And so there are interesting conversations happening now too that I think support this idea that it's really not about innocence and guilt. And, we should continue to focus on what the government has done wrong and continues to do wrong.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, I'd be interested to know how that message is going down, particularly in the US amongst the population, because I know that when we were showing Guantanamo in the Road to Guantanamo in the US, a lot of times that question, no one would really bring up the question, but I would say, well, look, what do you think? I kind of put it back to some of the journalists and saying, what do you think? Do you think this place, surely conceptually, it shouldn't exist, regardless of who the prisoners are? And a lot of people seem to struggle with that. I mean, particularly at that time, it was all very raw and still, it was, the base was only really kind of known as a place in those couple of years. But I struggle with the concept of it. It's like, yeah, okay, these guys happen to be innocent, but if they've been guilty, they still shouldn't be in Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah, I think people still ask that question and we still get it. But to the point I made earlier, I think with so much time that has passed and really understanding that, someone could have come to Guantanamo when they were 20 and now they're middle-aged, if you can call people in their 40s middle-aged, but that so much time has passed that regardless of what someone may or may not have done in their 20s, that surely they should be given the opportunity to rebuild and start a new life. And so it's I think it's a question people want to know. And in the confession too, there's so much of like, well, should you have been doing this? Or it's sort of like, that's not the question to ask. And I think that's really the pivot, is like, these are the questions that we need to be asking. So yeah, it's a challenge, but I'm lucky enough to say in the spaces that I'm in, people are looking for more kind of sophisticated, I think, analysis of what's going on at Guantanamo at this point, 20 years later.
Thank you. Matt, staying with you, do you feel that your movie shifted perceptions. And the reason I asked that is because I remember very, very clearly seeing the news after the Berlin Film Festival, soon after the movie had been released, of Riz Ahmed, who is now obviously a much bigger star than he was at that time. In many ways, your movie kind of started his movie career, at least. He now stars in Star Wars and Venom and various other movies. But you win the silver award, if I remember correctly, at the Berlin Film Festival. He comes back home to the UK from there, and he's stopped by border police and assaulted and questioned about his views on Palestine and his views on the Middle East and on almost everything. He's got actually a very beautiful essay on this in The Good Immigrant that he writes about that experience. It's a very, very stunning piece of writing, actually. So, I mean, that must have been quite deflating in many ways for you and for the whole team. Could you tell us a little bit about how you felt in light of kind of the impact you felt that this movie was supposed to have in terms of shifting perceptions?
Well, I think it's difficult with movies, isn't it? I mean, I think they do have an impact. It's not necessarily the one you expect. It's very hard to try and connect with a wider audience. I mean, I think so we were financed by Film 4, and the deal was that it was going to premiere the same week on Channel 4 as it was going to be shown in cinemas. And for me, that was the audience we wanted, because I was just hoping people would come across it channel hopping, or they'd find it on YouTube. But I remember, so I directed it with Michael Winterbottom, and his thing was like, I don't care. Like, we were asked about piracy, because piracy was a big thing at the time, and he was like, I'm very happy for everyone to pirate this. Like, get out there. I want this on YouTube. Get it on your phone. Whatever you can do. I can imagine it was like horror from all the financials, but that was the whole point. It's like, spread the message. And I think actually the work is done by Aliya, by Moazzam, by campaigners like you, Asim, but ultimately filmmakers, you try and get the message out there. I think it was part of many different campaigns at that time to try and raise awareness, which I think it must have done to a degree. But ultimately, films in themselves don't really change that much. They're part of a dialogue. Unfortunately, that's kind of it. And even when we were in Berlin talking to journalists, I mean, we did get a lot of criticism saying, well, this isn't really true, or this is kind of hearsay, or this is old hat. And I think, going back to what I said before, I think it's just the one thing I always came back to is that, yes, of course, a lot of this is out there as a matter of public record, but it's still disputed. And I think once you see it and you connect with someone, an actor like Riz, embodying that person, then suddenly you really care. And as much as, again, coming from a political background and so on, there's one thing to read it in an Observer article. So David Rose was the person who was pushing that story, and he wrote a book about them. But ultimately, it's sad to say, but you read it and it kind of slides over you to a degree. And I think when you see it viscerally, you connect with those people if it's done in the right way. That's as much impact probably as a film can hope to have, I think.
Thank you. And and staying on the subject, Moazzam, of seeing these depictions, I think it would be remiss of us not to acknowledge the fact that it must be very hard for you to watch these films. Like Matt's, like the Mauritanian, like many others, and I know that you've watched them all. And if you don't mind me asking, how does it feel to watch depictions of Guantanamo as a survivor?
I remember when I first saw The Road to Guantanamo, I was, I think maybe Gareth gave me the DVD. I'd come back not that long after myself, and I was sitting and watching it. I think I was watching it by myself, and then two of my kids walked in, and they came to the door, and they opened the door, and they just started looking. And at that time, my eldest daughter, she was about 10, my younger son was about 8, and they were just looking, and they didn't stay for that long. I think they stood there for about 10 minutes. It was a particular scene when they first brought into Guantanamo in their signature orange jumpsuits, and they were made to kneel and are being abused by the soldiers and shouted at and screamed. And then we didn't say anything. And then a few hours later, my daughter came and said, Baba, is that what happened to you? See, by this time I hadn't written my book. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know the detail. They knew I was in Guantanamo. They didn't know the detail. And here was a depiction that they'd seen. And they were a bit scared to ask, that was it like this? And it's not the kind of film that I would show my children. It just happened to walk in on it. But since that time, of course, they have very much become aware, and that, you know, they grow into adults and so forth. I have seen films, like you said, I have seen every film, I think, about Guantanamo that I'm aware of, including 5 years of my life about Murad Kurnaz. And every time when I see the film, even Camp X-Ray, which is the Kristen Stewart and a fictitious depicting of a prisoner and a relationship with a god. Yes, it tells a story, and I sit there and I watch, and it is very painful to watch it, not because I was there, not because I was there. It's because of what's happening to that person, what they're going through. I try to watch it as somebody who is interested in these subjects, but you know, my own story is its own story, its own experience, and I always think that I got it off. I got off a lot better than other people. I always feel that, and one of my closest friends is Shakir Amr. Mansour Dayfis just started working for Cage. Still, even now to this day, after 14 years in prison in Guantanamo, the guy has no ability to live a normal, meaningful life. He's been resettled to Serbia, of all places, where Islamophobia, Islamophobia is rife. It started there with, you know, the massacre of the Muslims of Srebrenica. So I look at Shakir Amr. He was my closest friend. There was very, very little distinction between our circumstances. We lived in the same house in Kabul together. He had the same number of children as I did. He had a child born straight after he was taken into custody. The difference was I was a British citizen and he was not. So he remained in Guantanamo for 14 years. I came home to see those children 3 years later. Okay, 3 years is big, but it's incomparable. It's incomprehensible compared to 14 years. You come back home and you see children, grown men, grown women, and you are an entire stranger in their life. And Shakir Amr lived in Britain, in Battersea, and he was taken by Americans. And so this didn't happen in some kind of, you know, deepest, darkest developing nation. This was like the world's most powerful nations, the bastions of democracy and freedom and human rights. And they did this. And as I said again, no accountability whatsoever, not an apology, nothing. So watching all of these films, I mean, for me, it's very important that they're done. I can't stress the importance of these films because they do come into the collective memory of people. They're there to be seen, and you can refer people to them throughout history. They'll be there forever. As long as there's an ability to distribute film, these films are going to be there forever. And now with the way technology is, you can simply send a person a link to the film and say, listen, just watch this and make your own mind up. You know, and in Arabic, there's this famous saying, that hearing about something is not like seeing about something. And these depictions in these films are so powerful. Look at the Mauritanian. I've met Mohamedou in Bagram for a very short amount of time, but I didn't know the detail of what he'd gone through. I didn't know that was happening in Guantanamo. I knew the torture that happened before it, but I didn't know that there was that extent of that type of abuse in Guantanamo. I'd heard it about other prisoners, but again, the depiction is what makes all the difference. And I think that these films do a job. I think Matt is undercutting himself when he says this, but I think that they do a crucial job in keeping something there in the record.
Absolutely.
Can I just add something? You know, and like Moazzam saying, I mean, there's so many books about Guantanamo, and I probably haven't picked up many of them, but I too have tried to watch every movie that has come out. But, you know, I'm so grateful to Moazzam, to Mohamedou, to Mansour, people who, despite everything that they've gone through and what's clearly sort of still can be traumatic for them to talk about, that they do talk about it. And, you know, I think one of the challenges in our work is we have so many clients who are interested in having us continue sort of public advocacy and using their stories, but they don't want to talk about it. They want to forget it, but they recognize the importance of the work. And so, you know, when I used to do public speaking in the US before virtual panels were a thing, you know, I would struggle with saying that, you know, if you only got to see this person or talk to him directly, that would do so much more than an hour of me talking. And so one upshot of the world we're in now is that people can speak on these panels. And in the confession, I saw that Moazzam was speaking to students at LSE and talking directly to them. And I wish that could happen in the US. We know that it can't because of former detainees aren't allowed there, but grateful for the people who speak and use formats like the internet to bridge those connections.
Him, but I thought before we get his view on it, it would be great to hear from yourself and your impression of the confession, like your generally.
I'm sorry, Asim. I don't think did anybody hear what Asim said? He sounded like a robot. An incomprehensible robot.
I think the question, if I'm looking at the list, was about our impressions of the confession, Matt.
Well, right. Well, I mean, I thought it was a very powerful, very moving film. I think I suppose if we're going back to, it was very kind of both of you to talk about the impact of films and about Road to Guantanamo. I feel like, I mean, I flip between feeling optimistic about the power of cinema and television to connect with people and tell a story in a way that's important. There's a danger, I suppose. What we were worried about was ending up preaching to the converted. So, we knew that probably by its nature, when we had limited cinema release, which is what a documentary can get, the sheer act of buying a ticket and walking through buying a ticket, walking into the cinema hall, is you're probably already going to be on board. You will be interested in that subject matter. You'll be broadly sympathetic with what it's trying to say. So that was our concern, and luckily we had a simultaneous television release, and so that did seem to have a big impact, at least in Britain, and similar kind of campaigns in the US and so on. So I mean, that was definitely, and so I feel like, like we've said, the Tipton Three are not advocates; they're not political, and I think the power of Moazzam's film is that he is incredibly. You're very eloquent. There's a kind of quiet, determined dignity, very, like a huge power to the way that you speak. And so there's so much noise. We live particularly now in an era where it's just chaos, and every day the news is the 24/7 news cycle. You're moving on to the next thing. And if you sit and watch that film, it's inarguable. It's completely inarguable. There's all this hysteria that surrounds Guantanamo Bay. And then you just have Moazzam, who lived through it, just talking you through it and why it was so hugely unjust and what exactly what happened to you. I just, that's, for me, it's incredibly moving, but it's like you finally having your day in court and being able to speak to people directly. Like that, I found it very, very moving, incredibly powerful. I know, I'd read your book. I knew your story, but I think there's something about you speaking directly to us, which is it's incredibly, it just works in a different way. And I just suppose, I mean, that's why I would gravitated towards cinema and TV early on, because I think it's one of the most powerful tools we have to communicate with people and to tell stories, whether they're fictional stories or whether they're real stories in this case. And I just, I found it was incredible to watch. And I hope it connects with people in the way it deserves.
One thing I want to say to respond to Matt is that I actually went to a post-screening Q&A with the Tipton Three. I think it was at the Birmingham Mac. So this was, people weren't hostile. They were actually, in fact, it was hilarious the way they answered questions. Somebody would ask them a question, and by the time the end of the question would be given, they said, "What did you say again?" And then just kind of confer with each other. And they weren't intending to do that. That's just how they were. But as you said, I'm come from a different background. When I went to screenings of the post-screening Q&A of the film around, there were people who bought the tickets who didn't believe me and who wanted to question more. I mean, several from across the board. I mean, of course, there was lots of people who supported it, and but there were, I think, in every screening there was always somebody asking more probing questions about, well, what about this part? You missed this part, or this part, and I don't really believe this part, and so forth. So I actually enjoy that a lot more than having yes people around. I like to have a good debate, a discussion with people, so that it can explain things to them that they would never have thought of. So for me, I think that was an important part. So, but yeah, that there is that fear of kind of preaching to the converted. When it got screened across the BBC, I thought, okay, this is a different place. This is it's going to reach a different audience of people, and maybe it hasn't reached in the way that I had expected or wanted it to, even though it was on the BBC. But it's there now. It's in that space, and it's there for people to see, whoever wants to dip into it and refer to it.
Moazzam, I don't think I've ever shared this with you, but I was at the that first screening of The Confession at the Renoir, and after the movie had finished, people were milling around and they were talking, and I was just standing casually by a group of people who were talking, and there's one woman, she said to her friends, well, he doesn't really answer why he was in Bosnia. I personally think he was probably a fighter over there, right? And then they're kind of like talking about this and having a laugh about it, whatever else. And so I kind of took the moment to interject, and I said, so hold on a second. Are you telling me, even if that's true, are you telling me that if you were in the middle of a genocide and you saw people being massacred and women being raped, that you wouldn't take up a weapon to defend them? I mean, like, even if he's not telling the truth about it, what would you do in that situation, right? Because I know what I would do, and I would have zero compunction in saying that I was there to fight if I was a fighter, because that would have been the right thing to do in that moment if you were there.
And
right?
kind of also, I mean, because I did say very clearly, I've said it in my book, and I've said it there, I thought I joined the Armia Bosanska, the third corpus of the Armia Bosanska. Pretty certain I said that. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to convince people. In the end, you think to yourself, right? Well, why did Bosnia happen? We had our troops there, British, Dutch, Pakistani, Turkish. They were all there with the United Nations helmets, and Srebrenica happened despite them, or in fact, I'd say because of them, because they offered that protection, and it's kind of looking past that completely. That a genocide took place. The biggest genocide after World War II, and that does not concern us. Rather, what concerns us is, well, why would you go there? I mean, the question is, why wouldn't you go there?
Yeah, and I think Ali, I think there's some really important questions that come out of The Confession, because it's not a movie that just ends at Guantanamo. Like there's post Guantanamo as well, and you have this whole other world that emerges with Syria, and a new phantom kind of threat emerges, and of course not just phantom, in some cases of course it has been real as well, and Moazzam gets caught in that world as well, and is kind of placed under suspicion. Moazzam will give you some of the details of further details of that, I'm sure, as we speak, but there's almost this kind of MC Escher type kind of situation where you feel that there are these tunnels and stairways, and like you're constantly being trapped in this never-ending cycle of not being able to escape from any route. How does what Moazzam express relate to what you see in terms of the American justice system? Because Guantanamo is one aspect of it, but I'll be honest with you, if I had a choice between going to Guantanamo and being sent to Supermax in the States, I'm not sure which one I would prefer. I'll be honest with you.
Before you answer, it has been said of my experience that I am the Forrest Gump of the Muslim world. Take that as you wish.
Yeah, that's a really big question. I was just going to say, the two things I really appreciated about The Confession, I thought it was excellent. And, I'm someone who's read about Moazzam's story, read some of his own writing, but none of that is sort of a substitute from hearing directly from him. So I learned a lot. And one, I just appreciated hearing sort of the clips of your family, of your father. And I think that's also a piece that's often left out or hard to sort of bring into the story, is really the impact on families and communities. And I thought that was really, really moving. And then also, right, that your story doesn't stop once you come home. In fact, it sort of takes on a different life. And I think that's very true for many of the people who leave Guantanamo, is that the stigma and the experience doesn't leave them once they leave the prison. And the situation of men in other countries varies completely based on when they were transferred, where they were transferred, sort of the security state that they're subject to in certain places, which also affects their ability to speak out, to get travel papers. We know that that's something Mohammedou's really struggled, even in Mauritanian, to be able to travel. So, so I just thought that was really fascinating. And to your question about the U.S., there's a lot to say. But, I think we've worked with different communities affected by the war on terror. And, I think there are a lot of commonalities, which is really that even after the incident is over, the harm continues. And whether that's the personal trauma that you feel, the chilling effect of what happened to you, the stigma as you return to your own community, lack of trust with any sort of government agency or law enforcement. But I think there are, like you mentioned, the supermax. There are pieces of this that still so many people don't know about. I mean, we've had active litigation, and CCF has done a lot of work with people who are subjected to special administrative measures in prison, the communication management units. Like these are things that many Americans, many Muslim Americans who are even sort of doing war on terror work just aren't familiar with. And so even 20 years later, there's a lot of education work that still has to happen. I mean, Guantanamo, for better or worse, is so well known that it can be sort of the easiest thing to talk about and kind of compare things to. But in many ways, I think it also overshadows the experience of other Muslim prisoners within the United States, the various terrorism charges that have put people in prison, surveillance, like the list goes on. And so the film festival is actually it's a good way for me to say you should watch all the films and watch all the panels to hear more about those. But, I think in some ways advocating around Guantanamo can be easy because everybody sort of knows something about it. But there's just so much that's like even more hidden, and which is why sort of the films that we'll watch this month will really help, I think, educate people on that.
Thank you for that. So, I mean, Moazzam, I did want to hear from Aliya and Matt before I came to you about the confession. But I mean, I've heard your story so many times that I think I could probably tell most of it. Recount your tale for other people. But as Aliya says, that every time I hear you speak, it's almost like I'm hearing you speak for the first time. And watching the confession felt like that to me. Like it was just in some ways seeing things or hearing about aspects of the story in a new light. But I did wonder about you being the center of the story in such a format. Like you're used to giving talks, which is about your story or parts of your story, but this seemed like so acute. It almost felt like an interrogation at times, because of the setup, because of the desk, because of the way that they had done everything, and perhaps that was purposeful. But did you feel any sense of apprehension about having a whole film based on your experiences and the way that it was portrayed?
Okay, I've got to tell you, I had no idea that it's going to be an entire thing. I just thought that they're doing what lots of documentary filmmakers do, and that is they interview you for a whole long period of time and they take like 5 minutes from it and they use that and they splice that up too. So I really didn't think that it was this type of thing. I just thought it's going to be lots of, it was a long conversation, and I think it took place over 2 days. And it did to some extent feel a bit like an interrogation. But it wasn't an interrogation. We sat and had coffee and ate sandwiches and stuff in between, and chilled out and relaxed. But do I think about me being the center of a story? Do I feel apprehensive about that? Sometimes, yes. I mean, I spoke to people when I came back from Guantanamo, and this was Clive being Clive. He said, "Look, we've got you can write a book, We've got an interview sorted for you, and you know there's a film. You can get a film out of this. It's important because you can tell the story in in Clive's style. But I think at that time I spoke to people, different filmmakers who were talking about making a film based upon this, and I think in hindsight I'm glad that it probably didn't happen. For whatever reason, the filmmakers I spoke to, some of them had actually made a treatment of the film, and they were kind of well-known filmmakers, but they were cold feet, or there was saturation, or whatever it was. I don't know, but I think I'm glad, because whatever my story was, I thought that if you want to tell a part of my story, I think the most important part of my story isn't to do with Guantanamo. It's to do with growing up in Britain. It's to do with being in the streets here and having to survive against skinheads and being told to go back home by them. And you know, I do every day, but they mean my parents' home, or where they originate from. I had thought that if there's any film that I want to tell, it's to do with that, as opposed to the Guantanamo stories, because there are so many other stories there that have got so much more detail, and are so much more intense. Like what would happen with the Tipton guys? It's still beyond belief what they went through, the period of before they get to Guantanamo. And people do need to understand this. For most people, the process of before you get to Guantanamo, you go through the dark prison, you go through the salt pit, you go through Bagram, you go through different secret detention sites around the world, Thailand and Romania and Poland, Morocco. Everybody's involved. They're all involved in the torture program, and that part of it still hasn't. I think that part of it still needs to come out. You know, there was a recent film called The Report about the torture files, and the CIA sent a report, and Dianne Feinstein's office doing the investigation and the report. But that film is really excellent, but it tells you nothing about the experience of the prisoners who've been tortured. So again, the Hollywoodization of this is that it takes away entirely from the experience of the prisoners. The prisoner is an afterthought. The actual person is an afterthought. So I still think that there's so much room for stories to be told, and that's why I encourage all of these guys. So many people I'm speaking to, even now as we speak, have written their books and are in the process of writing their books. Mansoor just finished his. Faiz Al-Kandari's finished his just now. It's going to be translated into English. So you've got all of these people, and I think these books, they need to be made into films. And each story is so unique. There are crossovers, but and I'm glad mine's not there. As I said, if I want a film to be made about my life, I want it to be made about fighting skinheads on British streets.
Thank you, Moazzam. So my apologies to the audience, because there have been a number of questions that have come through, but we've just been so engrossed in this conversation, it's been difficult to get to them, and we've pretty much run out of time now. And so instead, you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to please ask our panelists to give me kind of 1 minute on kind of reflecting on not only the films, but of course, like the significance of the moment that we're in, and maybe any thoughts for the future too, please. So maybe if we start with Aliya, then Matt, and we'll finish with Moazzam, and then I'm afraid we'll have to end the event there. So again, my apologies to the audience for not being able to get to their questions.
Yeah, I'll try to not really answer questions, but I know some people have questions specifically on where Guantanamo is now. So I'll just say, the 20th anniversary is an opportunity both to reflect and move forward and build together. And so, I just, for folks who are interested in the issue, please check out CCR's website. But we're so close. I mean, there's so much that can happen in this next year. And so I do want to put it on President Biden to really take action and start releasing men who are at Guantanamo. In terms of what justice can look like, the first step for justice is closing this place, and then having a conversation about what reparations might look like, apologies, things like that, which is long-term work. Will probably take another 20 years, if not more. But that's what we also have to be building. So really grateful for films that can educate people and bring us on the same page, and hopefully energize people who want to take action, who want to do more. So I'll just leave it there that I am hopeful that at some point, we can have these conversations and be happy that Guantanamo is closed, and now we're just working on repair and healing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, I think when we made Road to Guantanamo, we wanted to make it very quickly. That was the main thing, because it was happening and it was so transparently, so clearly wrong, that we just couldn't. We just felt like we want to get it out there and kind of be part of the campaign, because surely this thing will be closed within months. I mean, it was so. It just seemed it was just so unjust. The concept of it still being open in that form, even a scaled down form 20 years later, just feels now completely incomprehensible. I mean, I really, really hope through, you know, for the advocacy you guys are doing, that it does close soon. But like you said, it's the tip of the iceberg. And I think in that sense, I think it needs to be part of a conversation about, you know, there is another side of, you know, to the way that the superpowers and actually countries all over the world, like you said, it's the UK and Morocco and all these other countries as well, do business. You know, we talk a good talk, and then actually there's a whole different way of doing things behind closed doors. And that needs to be, there's so much to do with conspiracy theory now, and all the, you know, everyone's talking, but everyone's so polarized right now. But there is a truth. You know, I think that's these stories need to be told. People need to hear what's actually going on, rather than just all the kind of the flannel and the noise around it. So I really, really, you know, I hope that in a small way, films can be a way of connecting with an audience, reminding them of the way the world is really run. And it's not any kind of conspiracy theory. I think all these things have now come out, and actually there's still much to be uncovered. So I wish you all the best of luck in that amazing campaign.
Thank you. I have seen, I think, the question about habeas corpus. So just let me answer that. And that is, I think there's something around 8 different Supreme Court rulings that have been passed in favor of the Guantanamo prisoners. And yet no ruling in the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land in the most powerful nation in the world, that, you know, talks about the rights of habeas corpus, which themselves originate from Magna Carta, which is this great British writ that is so powerful that it has, and in the legal systems of the world, around the world. When I was taken into custody in Pakistan, my family petitioned the courts, and habeas writs were issued on my behalf in Pakistan. It didn't mean that I was released. Habeas decisions passed in the US Supreme Court didn't lead to the release of the prisoners. That's not what happens. The government keeps arguing at every single juncture. So it tells you here that Britain and America have jettisoned their laws when it comes to this so-called war on terrorism, and introduced the Guantanamoization of legislation, not only in Guantanamo, but also here in Britain. We have courts here in Britain where people are detained based upon secret evidence. They were placed on control orders or house arrest based upon evidence they couldn't even see, and it still continues to this day. And so, I mean, just to say that there's Guantanamo at the worst end of the scale is present, but at the Guantanamoization of our legislation across the Western world is complete. Laws and wars on terror, I call that. The laws and wars on terror have undermined every single thing. When British government officials say that it must be a conspiracy theory for you to believe that we were involved in the renditions program in Diego Garcia, in Libya and elsewhere, and then it comes to the fore that we actually were involved. And then Theresa May apologizes to Libyan rendition victims who were handed over by the MI6 to Gaddafi. So we were in cahoots with every despot that existed. So, as I said again, the thing that's missing in all of this is the accountability process. If any individual had been involved in rendition, false imprisonment, kidnap, torture, murder, we'd have prosecuted them to the full letter of the law. When our governments are involved in it, they are entirely immune.
Thank you for sharing that, Moazzam. And, you know, really, again, thank you so much, first of all, to our audience who have been patiently watching and taking in this fantastic conversation. You know, I always feel very enriched every time I take part in one of these discussions. Aliya, for all of your work, you know, and for all the wonderful work that CCR is doing. Thank you so much for that. Matt, you know, really thank you for having placed the Road to Guantanamo in our path and started the process of all these wonderful films that have come up since. And of course, Moazzam Begg, my colleague, thank you so much for giving us your time. So I'll leave you with that, and hopefully you can enjoy the entire War on Terror Film Festival, and we've had a few guest appearances in between. So take care, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Goodbye.
Bye.
Great. Thank you, everyone.